Guten Tag, APUSH. We have a new video today. It's the Bee's Knees by the big cheese himself, Mr. Linegar. Let's make history today as we jaw over Unit 1, Day 1. But first let's do our daily punishment. What kind of concert only cost 45 cents? A 50-cent concert featuring Nickelback. Alright, your key terms for today are the Bering Strait, Animistic, Nomadic, Sedentary, the Pueblo, the Mississippian culture, the Atlantic Seaboard tribes, the Woodland tribes, Three Sister farming. We're going to go over Native American migration, the similarities and differences in Native American lifestyles, characteristics of Native American tribes before 1492, and characteristics of African society before the beginning of transatlantic slavery. So let's get started. All right, between 12,000 to 20,000 years ago, the Native American ancestors are going to cross the land bridge connecting Siberia and Alaska. This is called the Bering Strait. This is how what historians believe how North America and the Americas became inhabited over time. They crossed the land bridge from Asia, Siberia, and got to the Americas. That's the Bering Strait. We're going to talk a little bit about the common features of Native Americans. They did live in small, scattered settlements. Mostly, as far as generalizations go, women tended the crops. Mostly men would hunt, fish, and gather fuel. They would clear the fields for planting. They were animistic. Animistic is where you had multiple spirits and you worship the spirits or gods, and they usually represented a local natural characteristic, a local nature characteristic. So you might have like a spirit of the local river for the Native Americans, or there might be a spirit for like a set of trees or a rock or something like that. It's a little bit different from polytheism. In polytheism, it's a little bit more organized. You have a god of the ocean. You have a god of the sun. Here in animism, it's a little bit more naturalistic, and it's also a little bit more tied locally in animism. In animism, for the most part, they recognize each and every aspect of nature to have an individual particular spirit. So it's much more localized, and there's a much larger pantheon. They also don't have like the traditional understanding of gods, so it is different. You can tell this kind of idea of their animistic beliefs and their very naturalistic beliefs just in their myths. A lot of their myths are tied to nature. So, for example, the Salian people in present-day California, their creation myth was a bald eagle that formed the first man out of clay and the first woman out of a feather. The Lenape people told the earth was made when Sky Woman fell into the watery world with the help of a muskrat and beaver. They landed safely on a turtle's back, thus creating Turtle Island, or North America. The Choctaw believe that people began inside Great Mother's mound earthwork, Nunya in the lower Mississippi Valley. The Nawa traced their beginnings to the place of the seven caves from which their ancestors emerged before they migrated to what is now central Mexico. So a lot of their mythology does revolve around nature, animals, characteristics of the earth. Some more common features of Native Americans. Many tribes were matrilineal, so they traced their descendants from the female side. There was greater sexual and marital freedom. Native American women, for the most part, will have much more rights than European women when we talk about them, or even American women for early on. There is little distinction between the natural and the supernatural. There isn't the concept of like the postmodernist idea of modern science. They also had a different idea of property. A lot of Native Americans believed in the idea that you couldn't own an individual piece of land. You can't own land. Like as much as there was land ownership in Native American tribes, uh, it was shared amongst them all. Like the tribe owned the land, not one individual. But they didn't recognize the idea of individual property ownership, which is going to cause conflicts when the Europeans and the Americans come and they try to take their land. Let's talk about some of the differences in Native American tribes. Most were nomadic. For example, the Arapaho, the Blackfoot, the Apache, the Comanche, and the Crow. Nomadic means you travel from one place to place. You don't have one set place you're living in. Usually people that were nomadic ride horses. They travel from place to place. They hunt. They are semi-sedentary a lot of times. A lot of times, if you're nomadic, you're very warrior-based. So, like the Apache were very warrior-based. They would raid different settlements when the Spanish came. Then they would move to a different part of Mexico, New Mexico, Arizona, or Texas and attack. Some tribes, however, were sedentary. They would actually farm, and they would settle in one place, or they were semi-sedentary, or they would settle in one place for part of the year. Examples of these were the Caddoas, the Omaha, and the Pawnee. This is an example of nomadic tribe. This is sedentary. They're settled in one place. Continue with differences for the Native Americans. The Northwest Native Americans hunted salmon, so they had different types of food. The Plains Native Americans followed the bison, which is the buffalo. The Basin ate snakes, so like their food diet varied. They had different types of communication. The Ojibes used birch bark scrolls. The Plain tribes artisans wove using buffalo hair, so different types of art. There was hundreds of different types of language. There's not just one language for the different for all the Native American tribes. They differed in how they adapted to the environment. So, for example, some of the tribes on the West Coast used totem poles. When you get to like Alaska and some of the colder regions in Canada, they made igloos. Some of them made wood houses. Some of them made teepees. Some of them made cone-shaped huts. Some of them did mud adobe houses made out of mud bricks, which we'll talk about. That's the Pueblos. So they even had like different types of building, different types of architecture. And like even if we're not going over the individual tribe, if we're just like looking at it thematically by region, there was a lot of different types of tribes. So like the tribes, their culture, their characteristics, like their housing, their language, it really did vary. Let's start off talking about the Pueblo. The Pueblo were located in the southwest of the United States. They were masters of irrigation system for farming because it was really hot where they were. The Pueblo were in Arizona, New Mexico, that area. They're going to use the dirt to make adobe houses, which is made out of mud bricks. And you can see like their adobe houses right here. The adobe houses were multi-storied and terraced buildings. They're one of the first Native Americans the Spanish will have contact with in what we consider North America, the United States, after the Aztecs. Another tribe which we don't know quite as much about is the Mound Builders. They're also called the Mississippian culture. They had the largest settlements early on in the United States. Their capital, Cahokia, which is near St. Louis, had as many as 25,000 people. Their culture began to fall by 1300 before Columbus. We don't know what happened. It could have been an ecological disaster. It could have been other tribes destroyed them. Historians, for the most part, think it probably had something to do with the environment that caused them to collapse. But by the time the Europeans came, they were already gone. But you could still see parts of their civilizations with their mound builds, like right here. And since then, there's been archaeologists, and we've been able to get more ideas about the Mound Builders. The next one is the Atlantic Seaboard tribes. The Atlantic Seaboard tribes were made up of different tribes. For example, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Cherokee. One of the big things here was they are going to have a rich diet. They grew maize, which is corn, beans, and squash. This is called Three Sister Farming. The Three Sister Farming is going to lead to a rich diet which will produce high population densities. The way they did Three Sister farming is they planted the maize and the beans right next to each other in a mound, and they planted the squash in between that area, uh, in between the mounds. It allowed for like more nutrients to be soiled, to prevent the nutrients from becoming depleted, and it's going to allow for more food to be grown. Because of that, there's going to be a lot of food grown in the Atlantic Seaboard tribes. Three Sister farming is going to be rich in nutrients. It is going to create higher population density. Next, the Eastern Woodlands. The Eastern Woodlands were in the northeastern United States, Pennsylvania, New York, part of that area. One of the biggest examples of the Eastern Woodlands were the Iroquois Confederacy. The Iroquois Confederacy was a confederacy of different Native American tribes. They actually united into a semi-united government. The different tribes were kind of united together, but it was pretty decentralized. It wasn't like you think of like a modern day nation state. But the Iroquois Confederacy is one of the first examples of Native American tribes where they had a pan-Native American unity and like very pretty strong organization for their government. It had political and organizational skills. Like I said, the Iroquois Confederacy was decentralized. There was usually 6 tribes for the most part. There were 6 tribes, 6 big tribes in the Iroquois Confederacy. Each Iroquois nation ran its own internal affairs with a council of elected delegates. They also sent delegates to a ground council. It ran affairs amongst the nation. It is a federal system, which is what we have in the United States. So it has like state and national government, which would be the tribe and the confederacy. The 6 major tribes in the Iroquois Confederacy were the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, the Seneca, and the Tuscarora. Let's talk about African societies, because we do need to have some context of Africa, because when the Europeans come, they will bring African slavery there, but it's important to give context of what Africa was like before European stealing of humans. So in African society, many of the societies were matrilineal also. They traced their descent from the female line. The priest did reign over the masses of farmers and craftspeople. Below the masses were slaves. African slavery was much different than European slavery, which we're going to talk about in a second. There were large African civilizations, usually in the coastal areas of Western Africa, Eastern Africa, and a little bit of Southern Central Africa. So like in Western Africa, you had Songhai, Ghana, Mali. They were all Muslim. The Muslims explored parts of Africa earlier on in the 1200s. In East Africa, you had the Swahili city-states. Once you got out of the big civilizations in the big cities, most African societies were very tribal-based. They were animistic and nomadic. So it's really only like the urban areas, like the actual civilizations that are more Muslim and are more sedentary. Lastly, let's talk about African tribal slavery, because it is important to distinguish what African slavery was like when they were enslaving each other versus what the Europeans created with the transatlantic slave trade, which was much worse, obviously. So in African tribal slavery, there were rights for African slaves. Often the slaves were war captives, criminals, and debtors. They could marry, which is different than what the Europeans could do, or the marriage wouldn't be recognized. They could be educated, which is big different. They could have children, and their children were not automatically slaves. Also, there was no stigma attached with being a slave. It wasn't a racially based system. When the Europeans are going to start really focusing on African slavery, they're going to make it into a racial based system, and the idea of superiority and inferiority of different races. You don't see that with African tribal slavery. I'm not saying it was good. It's not good at all. But it wasn't necessarily permanent. There were recognizable rights for the Africans, and there wasn't like a racist-based stigma attached to it. So it was much different than the transatlantic slave trade. All right, kiddos, and that's all I have for today. That's the end of the first video. So, until next time, deuces, deuces, yeah.